since it is the July 4th weekend coming into the holiday. In fact, I'm going to begin with a video that we played yesterday special, because a lot of people don't get the internet. And so we'll put this on the sermon. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take a very nostalgic look from a biblical point of view for July 4th. Now, I've been talking about July 4th, and you've heard me talk about Tammuz 17 for a few years now, since we actually come across this, I believe, in 2014, 2015, and tying it into some of the things we're doing today. So let's begin with a video here from John Wayne. I mean, what's patriotism without the Duke? I actually got an email back in this morning, somebody watching our special from yesterday, Jeff forwarded to me from the website, and he says that he's going to his 50th high school year reunion to give us an idea of his age. And he said the videos that we played yesterday, he's never seen before in his life. And so I said, well, you know, it's time we pick up on some of our heritage. So if we're ready, this is a video by John Wayne, says, America, Why I Love Her. So if we're ready, let's go ahead and play that.
You ask me why I love her? Well, give me time and I'll explain. Have you seen a Kansas sunset or an Arizona rain? Have you drifted on a bayou down Louisiana way? Have you watched the cold fog drifting over San Francisco Bay? Have you heard a Bob White calling in the Carolina pines, or heard the bellow of a diesel in the Appalachia mines? Does the call of the Niagara thrill you when you hear her waters roar? You look with awe and wonder at her Massachusetts shore, where men who braved a hard new world first stepped on Plymouth's rock. Do you think of them when you stroll along a New York City dock? Have you seen a snowflake drifting in the Rockies way up high? Have you seen the sun come blazing down from a bright Nevada sky? You hail to the Columbia as she rushes in the sea, or bow your head at Gettysburg, our struggle to be free? Have you seen the mighty Tetons? You watched an eagle soar? Have you seen the Mississippi roll along Missouri's shore? Have you felt a chill at Michigan when on a winter's day her waters rage along the shore in thunderous display? Does the word aloha make you warm? Do you stare in disbelief when you see the surf come roaring in at Waimea Reef? From Alaska's cold to the Everglades, from the Rio Grande to Maine, my heart cries out, my pulse runs fast, the might of her domain. You ask me why I love her? I've a million reasons why. My beautiful America, beneath God's wide, wide sky.
Well, I want to talk about reason why I love America today, through the promises of God that He gave to this nation and the fulfillment to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So today I'm not going to take a technical look. I'm going to take more of a spiritual look and a very personal look. I want to share with you what God has done for 4,000 years to bring us to what He plans to do with us in the future. Today I'm calling our sermon, God's Jump-Off Point. God's Jump-Off Point. So what do I mean, God's jump-off point? If you go looking for it, you're going to find it at the corner of July 4th, 1776 and Tammuz 17. Does anybody know where that intersection is? That's God's jump-off point. So if you go out and look for it, go up down to the byways and it says, hey, listen, I'm looking for the intersection of July 4th, 1776 and Tammuz 17. Have you seen it? And you're going to get a lot of strange looks on your face. In fact, I bet if you went to the churches of God and you asked them for that corner, you might also get the strange look on the face. Because you see, somehow the Church of God has positioned ourselves that we can't look to the one side and see our Hebrew foundations, where we came from, or we can't look to the Protestant churches because of what they're using, because that's so ungodly. So we don't look at certain scriptures from the Hebrew, and we don't look at certain scriptures from where the Protestants use, because how many times do we ever use talking about Jesus in the manger? Never, because it sounds so Protestant. So what we've done is positioned ourselves between the two, and they shall never meet, and we lock out all this historical knowledge and information that we never use, which is kind of sad when you think about it. But it's also a way to protect the church and understand where it's come from. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you some things that we just never took the time to learn. And it's because it's at this corner that God begins his jump-off point. So now let's begin with the jump-off point. What I was really shocked, and I didn't plan it this way, I'll be honest with you. I was planning on doing this sermon a couple weeks ago, but this past week when we finished News Nuggets and Insights, we're sitting down and we're taping, and we finished the taping, and I began talking about next week and what the Saturday was. And we generally look at the calendar, we compare it to the Hebrew calendar to see what events are taking place. And I didn't realize I was delivering this sermon on today. And do you know what today is? Yeah, well, sure, it's June, but it's also another day. It's June 30th, no doubt about that. But it's also, if we look at the calendar on God's calendar, it's the month of Tammuz, and today just happens to be Tammuz 17. I said, wow, this is prophetic. I said, I'm telling everybody in our fish tank, everybody there, all four of us. I said, this is prophetic. God's guiding this. And of course, settle down, settle down. And so, but I was excited. I said, I wonder if God helped guide it this way. You never know, and it's probably not, and it's probably me living in a fantasy world. But it just happened to fall that way, and I didn't plan it. And so we're delivering the corner of 1776 and Tammuz 17 on Tammuz 17. Now, a lot of people say, what are you talking about, Tammuz 17? And I'm going to tell you that in just a few minutes for those who don't know. In fact, there was a young lady at our house came visiting, and her mom was in the Hebrew roots. And so I said, look at this. And this was a few weeks ago. I said, I'm going to be working on God's jump-off point in Tammuz 17. She goes, what's Tammuz 17? I said, you don't know Tammuz 17? And I just waxed elegant about Tammuz 17, and she just relaxed and said, okay. And she left. It's like, man, this is good stuff. You're missing it. All right, so let me go on. All right, so just what is? What's a jump-off point? All right, so what is a jump-off point? This is God's jump-off point of what I'm talking about. All right, so here's the definition for a jump-off point. It is a point from which to start a journey, an activity, an idea, or an example. It's a starting point that you're going to do something. There's another definition that says, it's a piece of information that is used to begin a process or activity. All right, so when I say it's God's jump-off point, what I'm saying is July 4, 1776 was the beginning of God doing something, is what I'm talking about. And he merged it at the intersection of Tammuz 17. Because, see, July 4, 1776 wasn't the original date that they thought was going to be our independence. Do you know that they thought it was going to be July 2nd? But that didn't work out for some reason. They had to go back and rework a few things. All right, so now, planning for or the execution of a jump-off point could take days, months, or years. For God's jump-off point for America, the planning took place nearly 4,000 years before it began. So that means that what God was doing for the last 4,000 years, he was maneuvering, bringing things about, moving nations, bringing in nations, removing nations, and moving peoples to be able to fulfill a plan that he was going to begin on July 4th, 1776. Now, a lot of people don't understand that. And the sheer impact of what I just told you goes right over our heads. Because they had to move nations They had to move kings. They had to bring in all of these things for 4,000 years for all of this to take place. So now let's talk about what a jump-off point is. So the easiest way I can describe it is they use the term jump-off point usually militarily. You don't hardly hear it anywhere else today, except in the military as a jump-off point. So I thought, I can best describe a jump-off point by talking about the D-Day invasion. All right, so what you're looking at here, so we pull that, if we can keep that up for a few minutes, Jeff. And so what you're looking at is a map of D-Day. And what you're looking at, all the stuff that's been stationed around is beginning on the D-Day. Like the beginning of the D-Day was June 6, 1944. Phase 1, our phase 1 is in the planning. The drop-off point for the phase 1 began at midnight at 2 a.m. when 13,000 paratroopers would have dropped off behind enemy lines, and they would have break down the enemy from behind the lines. Phase 2 began at 1 a.m. to 4 a.m., was to distract the enemy and the Allies, and that faked another invasion that took place in an unexpected reason, or give them a fake. Phase 3, a jump-off point there would be at 3 a.m. when the 300 planes dropped 13,000 bombs on the German defenses in the landing sector for the attack. Phase 4 was at 5 a.m. when they began the naval bombardment, which preceded the invasion, and then eventually Phase 5, after everything has been stationed and put into place, the actual invasion began. All right, so all of these things, all right, so here's what we're looking at. All of those things had to be planned. It had to be staged month after month. People had to be moved. Equipment had to be built. Bombs had to be developed. They had this incredible mass. It was the largest invasion in the history of mankind that took place. Just some of the statistics. Soldiers, they had 156,000 soldiers a part of it. Aircraft, they used 11,590 aircraft. 6,939 vessels. They used 71,000 naval combat ships. Never in the history of mankind has this much been brought together. All of that had to be staged and moved in place for the jump-off. So they had 195,000 Navy personnel that was involved. And so when it took off, everybody had a position, everybody had a job, everything was moved in its place, and it was all done. And on the other side, the German army, they were all preparing for where all this was taking place because they knew it was coming, but you know what they didn't know? They didn't know exactly where, and they didn't know exactly when. I said the irony of this jump-off point is almost like the return of Jesus Christ. It's because everything's being moved and jockeyed in place. So Satan knows it's coming, but he doesn't know exactly where he's going to be hit, and he doesn't know exactly when. But he knows it's coming from God's people, but he doesn't know how and where God's going to use them. So God is taking this time now, and I'm going to tell you the story how God brought you and us, the firstborn in God's kingdom. When we're born into the kingdom, right now we're begotten, how God has stationed each one of us, along with all of those through the last 4,000 years that he has called in this life to give them the truth for the jump-off point. It all began in 1776. So that's the jump-off point that I'm talking about today. All right, so now, just what am I talking about now at this corner? What does this have to do with an intersection of Tammuz 17? So the best way I can describe it is give you two questions. And then I'll go through and answer those two questions. All right, so question one. What was God beginning to do in 1776? Because you see, that's hundreds of years ago. And Christ still hasn't came back yet. But the staging had to be done, and it had to be jumped off. It had to begin to lay down the foundation for the plan for the end time return of Jesus Christ. So the question is, what is God beginning to do? And what in the world are we talking about at this intersection of July 4th and Tammuz 17? Why was it important that those two intersect at the beginning of the United States of America? The promise of the heritage. So now, to explain this, I'm not going to go into the depth of all this because it's real complicated. In fact, I'm going to show you there's some sermons I've already done that you can actually go online and you can get the information for. But we need to lay the foundation of where we got from to where we're going to. All right, so the promises were given to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. All people understand that, so I don't have to go back and explain that. So we look in Genesis 22, verse 18. It says, "And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice." Now, we understand that over the overall larger plan of God, we know in specific, this is talking about all nations being blessed through the one who is going to be Jesus Christ. We understand that. But it's also talking about more than just that. It's talking about the nations also would be blessed. So we're talking about a physical, we're talking about a spiritual would be blessed. This breaks down to two things: the promise of the scepter to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promise of birthright. Now, as you can see, and that's why I said I didn't want to get into a lot of depthness with this, because that's sermons alone. I mean, there's a lot of information. But I can give you some quick information to clarify what we're talking about. So in the scepter, when God promised it, the scepter would be the lawgiver, the law and the law given, it would be the nation of Judah and Christ. All right, through the promises we see in the Old Testament, there was a scepter promise, in other words, the promise of the law and the lawgiver, and then there was going to be a birthright. So now in Judah it says, his brothers will bow down to him, as his hand will be on the neck of his enemies, and the scepter will not depart from Judah. So as we understand, the scepter is like a king would hold the scepter. That would be rulership. That would be the law. In other words, he was given the position to be the law and the control of the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Thus, all the nations, because everybody's going to come under the nation, under the hand of Jesus Christ, and Jesus also came through Judah. So they were the scepter promised through Judah. Then it gets a little blurry through the birthright. And the world doesn't quite understand this because they misunderstand who Israel is today. They honestly think that Israel is that little country over there in the Middle East surrounded by all the Arab nations. And it is part. It is absolutely part, but it is only a small part. It is the nation of Judah, where the lawgiver and the promise and the scepter was specifically given back from the Old Testament. So let's talk about the blessing of the birthright. Now, here's what people don't consider when they talk about the blessing and the scepter and the blessing. Each one of these two comes with responsibility. The birthright comes with responsibility also. The firstborn always had a greater responsibility and always got a double portion of the blessing. So now, the scepter is easy to understand because that's been given to us. We just talked about that just a second ago. It says his brothers will bow down to him, his hand will be on the neck of his enemies, and the scepter will not depart from Judah, and that's from Genesis 49, verses 8 and 10. However, it tells us more in the New Testament, which reconfirms the Old Testament. Romans 3, verse 1 and 2. It says, "What advantage then has the Jew? Or what is the profit of the circumcision? Much in every way, but chiefly because to them was committed the oracles of God." All right, that is the scepter promise. So what we have from the New Testament through the Apostle Paul to the Romans is the reconfirmation of the scepter promise from the Old Testament carried all the way through after Jesus Christ into the New Testament. And from there, the Jews are required and have been kept the responsibility of keeping the law. All right, so that's what we have in the scepter. So that's pretty plain. Almost no one disagrees with that. However, when it comes to the responsibility of the birthright, now we've got a problem. People don't quite understand how this applies today, primarily because they don't believe and they understand who the nations of Israel are today and where they exist, or that they even exist at all. All right, so now let's go through that just real briefly. All right, the firstborn blessing. Now, when you look at the Old Testament, who's the firstborn of the tribes? Reuben. But Reuben got disqualified. Reuben was disqualified. So, I want to stop here because when I was putting this sermon together, I had to stop because something suddenly struck me that was very alarming when I read this part here. When we understand, you and I understand, so I said this is going to be a more personal and not as technical as some of my sermons in the past. Because I want this to touch your heart. Because I want you to think about where we're going through. Because I hear the churches of God, many of them today, will say, you know what, we're tired of hearing about prophecy. You know, we're tired of hearing about end-time warning messages and witnesses. And I thought about that as I just read what I just read here. I'm typing this in my computer. Reuben was disqualified from his birthright. And then all of a sudden, like this terror came over me. And I thought about our churches, the churches of God. Now, this is what I want to make personal. And if you know somebody, whoever gets this tape, who's in the churches of God, we need to make this plain for everybody. We are the church of the firstborn. Are we not? That means if we don't fulfill the responsibility of the firstborn, we become like Reuben. You realize that? In other words, we will be disqualified from being a part of the firstborn. Now that's pretty scary because a lot of churches don't want to talk about end time anymore. That's so dangerous. And it's very alarming because you see, Reuben didn't get the blessings. When Worldwide went back into the world, Sunday keeping, changed its name, they disqualified themselves as part of the firstborn. In other words, you have an opportunity now that no other people on the face of the earth have, other than those that God has called and will call before the return of Jesus Christ. That comes with a responsibility. And that's one of the reasons we push so hard with the work we're doing, with news nuggets and insights every single week, with God gives us blessing to do, to cry out and to fulfill the warning that God says this. All right, going on. The oldest son was supposed to receive a double inheritance, so that Reuben would not be granted this privilege. Jacob asserts, this is in 1 Chronicles 5, turbulent as waters, you will no longer excel, for you went unto your father's bed and on my couch and defiled it. Genesis 49:4, talking about Reuben. Reuben's former dishonorable ways cost him in the end. Genesis 35:22. And you can go back and read all that. I'm just laying the foundation for what? So it was passed on by birthright too. The blessings in the birthright was eventually given to Joseph, including what people fail to understand. The sons of Joseph were given the name Israel. Now, so when we say God bless America, what we're saying and what I'm hearing is that God bless Israel. Those who bless this nation will be blessed. Those who curse this nation will be cursed. Those people who live in this country and it has become so polarized and so angry and so mean and vindictive is they don't understand when they curse this nation, they're bringing curses upon themselves. Because why? Because they were given the name of Israel. Now, people can disagree with it. They can argue it till they're blue in the face. I don't care. There's no way to disprove, and I'm going to show you where you can go back where we prove it in the sermon tapes in the past, and you go back and you can start reading it. I was on the phone for about an hour and a half with a man the other night, and he was very upset going on with the nation and all these things and certain policies that's going on. I said, listen, you need to go back and study these things. Because he wasn't in tune to the blessings of the nations itself. So now, Joseph was given the birthright. So Joseph is a fruitful vine. Joseph is in blessed and says he was given the double portions according to 1 Chronicles 5, verse 2. His bow remained steady, his strong arm staying limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob. Remember when Jacob wrestled with God all night long? So that his arms remained strong and wouldn't turn God loose. God could have got loose anytime he wanted to. But he let Jacob wrestle with him all night long. And so here we see that his arms are stayed strong but limber because the hand of the mighty one of Jacob. Therefore, let all the blessings rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. So the responsibility comes with that. All right, so the firstborn, the responsibility of the firstborn, along with the blessings bestowed upon Joseph, responsibility also came. And this is what people don't understand about the responsibility. And many in the churches today, especially the new people coming on board, have not been taught about the responsibility of the firstborn. See, it's not just the church. You're the firstborn. So you have to carry on the heritage of your father because you're the firstborn. It's passed on from generation to generation, right? So no longer do you look at it as a church. You're looking at this as, this is my father gave this to me. I'm the firstborn. So what am I supposed to be doing as the firstborn? So let's talk about that. Ezekiel 3, verse 4, 5, and 17. So he said unto me, Son of man, go to the house of Israel and speak my words to them, for you are not sent to a people of unfamiliar speech and of a hard language, but to the house of Israel. Now here's what you need to understand. When this command was given to Ezekiel, Israel was already in captivity. They were gone already. So the warning here and the commission and the command was not for the old Israel, it's for the new Israel. Because they were already in captivity, so he could not fulfill the commission. So that means God was looking down the road at the intersection of July 4th, 1776 and Tammuz 17. Because it couldn't be fulfilled yet. So God sees this, he knows they're in captivity, so he begins moving the nations to everything would align at a specific time, just like with D-Day, and God says, oh, and he jumps off and says, let's begin. Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word of my mouth and give them a warning from me. So Ezekiel sent to Israel to warn them. The problem is Israel was already in captivity. So the warning is for the end time. The responsibility of the firstborn that we see beginning way back in the Old Testament, long before Jesus Christ, was go to the house of Israel and warn them about what's coming, the impending doom, and the repentance that needs to be preached among the nations. That's the beginning of the warning and the responsibility of the firstborn. You can't separate the two. It is tied in and cannot be unlocked. And I'm going to show you that from the New Testament. Matthew 10, verse 5 through 7. Jesus Christ gives the instruction to his apostles. So Jesus sent the 12 out and commanded them, saying, do not go to the way of the Gentiles, but do not enter into the city of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Why? Because the command, the fulfillment of Ezekiel had not taken place yet. And so it's the command that even to the time with Jesus Christ, they weren't going to the Gentiles yet. That would be later after he was crucified, resurrected, and the Apostle Paul took the information to the Gentiles. But even Paul went to Israel first. Remember, you know the story better than most. So he went to there and he says, from now on, I'll wash my hands of Israel. He says, I'm going to the Gentiles. And Paul became the apostle to the Gentiles. That was a promise that God knew was going to take place, that it would be opened up for all mankind. Now, verse 7 says, now go and preach the kingdom of heaven. Luke 9 says the kingdom of God, which we like to use rather than kingdom of heaven, because it just makes it easier. People thinking they're going to heaven all the time. And if you keep saying the kingdom of heaven, they think you're preaching you're going to heaven. And so we call it the kingdom of God, because then you can explain the kingdom of God's going to be right here on earth, not in heaven. But anyway, it does say the kingdom of heaven, so I'm not trying to take away from that. We just use it as a point of expose to preach to the people so they understand we're talking about not in heaven, of heaven. Then, so as the beginning of the scattering, the preaching of the gospel begins, you see that in Acts 8, the pattern would be repeated over and over and over again. It never changed from back in Ezekiel. So the responsibility is this. What's the responsibility? Look at Luke 24, verse 46 and 47. Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for Christ to suffer and to raise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. Repentance and the remission of sins. Now, this is why I was so disappointed last year when one of the leading evangelists in the country, who's at the White House, went to every single capital, and he didn't talk about repentance. He simply talked about coming to God. You can't come to God unless you preach repentance. But people do not want to preach repentance, because then you've got to get specific. Repent of what? So then you have to talk about what sin really is. Then you get into the commandments. Then you get into the fourth commandment. And then you get into very specifics that people do not want to hear. But Satan wants everybody out there saying, come to the Lord, come to God, praise God. They want, God's churches are filled with that all over no, they're not God's churches. They're not God's churches, but they're people who could come to God when God's ready and opens up their minds. And I'll tell you, I'd rather have a nation full of people who are at least trying to serve God rather than not, because look what's going on now. So Jesus sets the example, and it never changes. Example in Matthew 4, verse 17. The very beginning of his ministry is recorded for us. It says, and from that time, Jesus began to preach and to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And it never changes. So what is our responsibility? Is to warn the nations, to warn the people that Jesus Christ is coming back, and you need to repent and bring them to God. For the kingdom of God is at hand. Don't you think Jesus knew 2,000 years ago it wasn't coming yet? But yet he said the kingdom of God is at hand. Because every generation who hears it, every generation who accepts it, everybody in that generation, the kingdom of God was at hand for them. Because when they wake up, the kingdom is there. Peter also did that in Acts 2, verse 38, the first recorded sermon after Jesus' crucifixion. Then Peter said to them, repent and let every one of you be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. What's the first thing he says? Repent. If you don't preach repentance, you're not fulfilling the commission and the responsibility of Jesus Christ. All right, so now, let's address those two questions with those foundations. You are the firstborn. You are the spiritual Israelites, and you have a responsibility that we see in Ezekiel carried through Jesus Christ to his apostles, and after he died, everyone ever since. So what was God beginning to do now? Now let's get into the specifics of the sermon. God was beginning, just like with D-Day, by 1776, God was staging his plan for the return of Jesus Christ hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Over the course of 4,000 years, God was placing all the parts in place to present an end-time warning message before the return of Jesus Christ, so that the prophecies of Ezekiel and the warning message would be fulfilled. People were preparing the warning, fulfilling the promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. God was staging all of these things now that I'm sharing with you to be ready for the end-time jump-off point that we're talking about today, to establish the free nation. Do you realize what we're doing today, and when I'm standing right in front of you, in front of this camera, right in front of everybody here, that could not be accomplished anywhere else but in the United States years ago. It was illegal. It was against the law. Religion was run by state and government. Even the Church of England controlled religion. Part of the reason the Patriots came over here to get away from all of that. All right, so what else happened? That all this took time, and time for the Israelites to come out of captivity. Because you see, when all this was taking place, they were in captivity. So God planned all these things, and understanding the 7-time promises of the curses. To know that when Israel went into captivity, there would be a 7 times 7 as a day is 1,000 years type scenario. That it would be 2,520 years that Israel would be lost before they came out of captivity. So all this planning, just like with D-Day, God had to move all these things in place so that they would begin to come out of captivity. Precisely, exactly 2,520 years that they went into captivity. Do you see what God was doing? Moving all these things around. So they all had to fall into place to put them coming out of captivity into the area that would have a free nation that could proclaim the warning message for the end time. This is incredible stuff when you look at what God was doing over the course of 4,000 years. The Christian migration began in Jerusalem. And that's what the Bible says, that you would begin preaching in Jerusalem. And he says, and you would go to Samaria and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. What God was doing there was, that's a prophecy, that it would go and spread around the world. So it began, and it would travel all the way around the world, and eventually would come to the New World, to what we know today as the United States of America. Now, I don't have time to go into the specifics of this. However, what I did is I went back and I've got the information. You can go online. You probably, if you've been in a church for a couple of years, you probably have these DVDs in your library, right? Or you can go online and you can get them. I highly suggest, if you haven't gone through these, go back and begin reading. There's 3 parts, and I go into very technical stuff. In this sermon, as you can see in these 2 slides, how technical it got. And you can go back and you can look through all of these things, and you can begin putting the pieces together that gives you the reason and the conclusions I'm giving you today. In addition to the Holy Roman Revival, which was a 3-part, just last year we did a 2-part sermon called 1776, The Rebirth of Israel. And in it, I went into the technical points of everything I'm giving you today from the spiritual end today. All the technical points are here. So in that, you've got 5 hours of information that supports the story I'm telling you today, that you can go back on your own time, open up the Bible and get through it and go into that, read every scripture, write your notes down. It's an expose that you'll have a tremendous amount of wealth of information and time of learning through that information, through those slides, where you can stop the DVD and you can just take each one as you go through it and learn, and so you can put all of this story together. So here's the summation of what's in those sermons. Israel began to go into captivity in 745. I think that's just BC. I don't know why I got the BCE on there. But then in 2 Kings 15, it talks about the beginning of their captivity. 2 Kings 15:29 talks about the second phase of them going into the captivity. Then 2 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 18 shows you the third stage of captivity. So Israel, over the course of 27 years, was gradually removed until they were completely gone in captivity, never to come back out, and are still lost until this day, except through the wisdom that God has shared with His church. All right, so 745, the beginning of the removal of the wealth of Israel. 732 is the beginning of the loss of their own governance, where another nation began to govern them. And then 718 was the final removal and the loss of their identity. When they went into Babylon, they were just gone. They never came back again. So when we looked at that and we tie it into today, where we're talking about America, the beginning of the restoration and of the resources and the wealth, 1776. And then when you look at and you go back into those sermons, you'll see that that is precisely 2,520 years. The 7 times 7 warnings of the prophecies of the curses that went against Israel. 732 was the beginning of the restoring of self-governance. What do we have there? The Constitution. The last one, it was the beginning of the fulfillment of the destiny of America, 1803, which was the Louisiana Purchase, and the beginning of the expanse across the nation that gave us the way to fulfill the 50 states, 50 representing Jubilee and freedom, is what we're looking at. So when we put them together, what do we have? It lines up exactly perfectly, 27 years in the Old Testament going into captivity, and the 27 years coming out of captivity. Exactly, precisely the same time, and each one of those dates is marked in history in this nation. It began 1776 as the jump-off point. For that time, God has spent thousands of years lining everything up to begin His end-time plan for the return of Christ. Now, we think the end time was like in our day. God began that end-time lineup back with 1776, moving everything through till today. 2,520 years, 2,520 years, 2,520 years. You realize what God had to do to have this stuff line up? And to have everything lined up for our nation to do that? God's jump-off point. So when you study this from history, you don't put these two together, but when you study it from the biblical perspective, you begin to see that God's hand was drive the events that brought about all this together. Daniel 2:20 and 21 says this. Daniel answered, he said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and he raises up kings." So we see that through all of this going on, God was moving kings and moving nations to have this come about. This is one that you probably never thought about, how important it was for God to intervene into the course of man and to remove a nation so that God's plan could be fulfilled. 1492, Columbus set sail for the New World. August 3rd, 1492. Any idea what day that was? In the Hebrew calendar, it was the 10th of Av. It was the day after mourning and fasting. The 9th of Av is a day of devastation for the nation of the Jews. It's when the two temples had fallen and they were completely removed on the 9th of Av. To this very day, the nation of Israel over there now still remembers as a day of fast, the 9th of Av. 3 weeks of mourning takes place before that. So what brought him to that stage? Just 6 months earlier, it was called the Alhambra Decree. So what in the world is that with Spain? It was known as the Edict of Expulsion. It was an edict that was issued on the 31st of March, 1492 by the joint Catholic monarchs of Spain, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. All Jews had 4 months to either convert to Catholicism or leave the nation. They had 4 months. At the end of it all, God moved Columbus to America, being supported by this nation. Now remember when I talked about D-Day when all the planning was going on and the Germans knew on the other side? Satan knows this too. See, Satan is aware of 2,520 years. He knew when they went into captivity because he was the one who helped bring it. So he knew when they would be coming out. So he knew that in God's plan, God had the maneuvering and staging. So what does Satan do when all this happens? Look at World War II. Because God was going to reestablish the modern nation of Judah because there had to be an end-time Jerusalem to surround armies. So he knew it was about time. So what did he do? Raises up Hitler. What does he do? Go after and kills all the Jews to destroy. Why? Because so God wouldn't fulfill his plan. So every time you see God beginning to make his move, you see Satan on the other side trying to prevent it. That goes on all the time. That was the one thing that was missing in the blood moon tetrads that I tried to bring out, that I did bring out in my book, that they didn't. They thought it was an end-time prophecy of the return of Christ. And what I was saying, it was the beginning of the warning of the return of Jesus Christ, and that we had time, it was looking forward, not backwards. But no one listened to that. But that's exactly what's going on, because this is the plan, the way Satan works. When God's ready to move, Satan's already got his defenses up to stop it. But he just doesn't know exactly where and when. And so you began to see Satan moving to destroy all the Jews so God could not reestablish the nation of Israel today. So now going on, Spain. So what took place following that? Spain becomes the first world superpower. Why? Because they were over in the New World, in what they would call at this particular time, the center of the world. Spain was literally the first world superpower. Why? Because they settled most of the Central and South American countries. And because of that, they had the hugest amounts of gold and the riches from the New World that was coming, and it gave them power and clout and money. But the problem was Spain is Catholic. So to this day, the Catholics run Central and South America. We know that. Try to imagine now, had God not intervened, what America would be like. If Spain controlled North America, we would not have a free Protestant Judeo-Christian nation. So now I'm going to tell you that story. I got a little video, runs 5 minutes long, talks to you about one of the most important days in the history of America. So let's play this next video, 1588.
What is the most important date in American history? July 4th, 1776, the date of American independence? Or April 12, 1861, the first day of the Civil War that ended slavery in America? Or maybe December 7th, 1941, the day the Japanese Empire bombed Pearl Harbor, bringing America into World War II. Or how about this one, July 28th, 1588. Yes, 1588, that's 30 years before Plymouth Rock and almost 20 years before Jamestown, John Smith, and Pocahontas. So why is it such an important date in American history? First, a little background. In 1588, the most powerful man in the world was the King of Spain, Philip II. Flush with gold and silver from the New World, he had no rival save one, Queen Elizabeth of England. England was a Protestant nation, and Spain was Catholic, as was most of Europe. In addition to considering her a heretic, Philip hated her for 2 additional reasons. First, she was financing a rebellion by the Dutch Protestants against Spain in the Spanish Netherlands, which Philip controlled. And second, because she had executed her rebellious cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, like Philip, was a Catholic monarch. Philip felt that Mary, not Elizabeth, was the rightful heir to the English throne. Philip felt that with the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth had gone too far. The time had come, he decided, to discipline her and her heretic nation. He came up with an audacious plan. He would invade England. To do this, he needed a large army and lots of ships. He needed an armada, 130 ships that would carry 30,000 men. Philip was very rich, but not that rich. To build such a fleet, he would have to borrow heavily. But this wasn't much of an obstacle. Once he had conquered England, he could use the English treasury to pay off any debts. The Pope, wishing to see England return to the Catholic fold, promised additional financing. So the ships were built, the soldiers recruited. Most importantly, Philip had chosen a competent man to lead them, the Marquis de Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz asked for more time to prepare his ships and men. But Philip was impatient, far too impatient as it turned out. In a massive stroke of misfortune, the first of many, Santa Cruz died just before the Armada was set to sail. Rather than take the time to seek a new suitable replacement, Philip pushed ahead and appointed Duke Medina Sidonia to take command. There was only one problem. Sidonia was an army general. He had no naval experience. In fact, he had never been out to sea. You can't hide 130 ships and 30,000 men. The English knew the Spanish were coming, and they were ready for them. What they lacked in firepower, they made up in maneuverability, familiarity with the treacherous English Channel, and the most capable and creative sea commanders of the age, Lord High Admiral Howard, Sir John Hawkins, and Sir Francis Drake. They knew they couldn't win a shootout with the Spanish. So instead, they launched a preemptive attack on the Spanish fleet while it was still docked in the French port of Calais. Setting a number of their own ships on fire, they sailed them into the port. The Spanish cut their anchors to flee the flaming English ships. But in their panic, they only made matters worse. The Spanish ships rammed into each other, tangling riggings, slicing sails, and crushing hulls. The vessels that weren't damaged were sitting ducks for the English cannon. Seeing that England had blocked their escape back to Spain, the badly wounded Armada sailed north into the Atlantic, hoping to regroup. But then the weather turned, and Mother Nature finished what the English had started. When it was all over, only 76 of the 130 Spanish ships returned home, and half of the 30,000 men were now at the bottom of the ocean floor. Spain never challenged England again. Spain never challenged anyone again. It was finished as a great power. So why was the defeat of the Spanish Armada so important to American history? If the Armada had won, England would have become part of the Spanish Empire. There would have been no further English exploration of the North American coastline. In all likelihood, Spain, not England, would have colonized the eastern seaboard and expanded westward. Spain would have ruled America as it did South America. There would have been no 13 colonies, no 13 original United States. The America that we know would not exist. Without a United States of America, there would be no Declaration of Independence, no Constitution, no Bill of Rights. The whole concept of American democracy, an idea that profoundly changed human history, would be unknown. The defeat of the Spanish Armada on July 28, 1588, made America possible. I'm Richard McMillan, Professor of History at Pierce College for Prager University.
Powerful little story that you never think about. Remember Daniel said, God raises nations and he removes nations. God needed this nation to exist for an end-time warning message for the world. So now we can see the connection to 1776, but why July 4th? So from the beginning of the signers thought that July 2nd would be the day for the Declaration of Independence. The signing of the Declaration of Independence actually took place on July 2nd when the delegates of the Continental Congress meeting in Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia approved the resolution that was introduced on June 7th by Richard Henry Lee in Virginia, calling for independence from Great Britain. And he wrote that these united colonies are right and ought to be free and independent states. It wasn't until 2 days later that they had went back and rewrote some of the declaration that they finally adopted the final draft on July 4th. So the Declaration of approval on July 2nd, 1776, they thought that that would be the day of our independence. So look what John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, declaring that the second day of July will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. He says, I am to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to Almighty God. That it ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows and games and sports and guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward and forevermore. God had a different plan than July 4th because it wasn't yet at the intersection of Tammuz 17. God's jump-off point in the corner, Tammuz 17. It is the intersection. So what is it? When we talk about it, it breaks down to this little bit of information. It is where the blessings meets warnings. It's that simple. God programmed and brought everything to pass that the foundation and the birth of this country began with a warning. Why did he do that? Because it's exactly what he did ancient Israel. Before they moved into the promised land, he began to give them warnings. And here he says, and I won't read because it's sake of time, but go back and write these two scriptures down and go back and read them. They pretty much say the same thing. Actually, Deuteronomy 31 was like a song. It was so important to remember the warning that they put it to music and to song. And they would sing it year after year. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, when they began to rehearse all that they did, God brought them through to bring them into the promised land. Verse 11 says this, beware that you forget not the Lord your God, and not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command you this day. So on July 4th, 1776, when God gave that to them, and it's on that day. Why? Because he wanted them to look back and remember, beware lest you forget that it is God who gives you this land. That was the warning that he gave them. And you can read all the way through to verse 20. And it says, let me start in verse 19. It said, and it shall be that if you forget at all to forget the Lord your God and walk among other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. As the nations that the Lord destroyed before your face, so you shall perish, because you would not be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. So now I bring you back to that phrase when I said that we as the firstborn, if we don't fulfill our commission, and I said that terror that came over me. And I'm reading this as the responsibility that goes with this warning. That if we as God's people don't fulfill the commission and responsibility, that we too will be like the other churches. And God will forsake us and put us aside and use someone else. And that's why it is so important that we as a church never forget why we've been called and that responsibility. And one of the things that we remember, now I didn't know this my whole life. Maybe you all did. I haven't talked to anybody that, but this information I don't believe was given to the church 20, 30, 40 years ago. Anybody in this room ever heard of this before? All right. Now, I'm not telling you this to brag because I don't think this has anything to do with that. But let me tell you why I think it's important that we understand it today, why this information is being revealed. Is because in Deuteronomy 8, God was getting to move them into the promised land. So he reveals to them the information of the warning and why. So why are we getting this today? It's because we're moving close to the return of Christ and into that promised land. So God is doing with us, the firstborn, just as he did with Israel, going into that promised land. And that's why this is information that's revealed today and wasn't revealed 50 years ago. Because God has a point for you and I so that we as a church, as a body of believers, his firstborn, never forget where he's brought us. Because if we do, you go back to the warning that you see right here. This is why it's so important that you share this with your brothers in the church. This message, if no other church message was sent out, needs to get to the church of God. It's imperative that we understand that because the commission has been laid upon the church of God and we have to be a part of that warning message. All right, going on. Tammuz 17, what is it? Tammuz is a day of destruction. It was the day that Moses came down and saw him worshiping pagan gods when he was up in the mountain with God. He came down and he broke the Jewish tablets. Tammuz 17. It was the day of the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, when they were forced to cease offering the sacrifices. It was the day when General Postumus burned the Torah and the night it was placed in the Holy Temple in the New Testament. It was the day that the walls of Jerusalem were breached in 70 A.D., opening up the doorway for the fall of Jerusalem in the 9th of Av. That day is a day of detriment and destruction. So every year when we go back as God's people, we look at July 4th. This year, when you look at July 4th, this Wednesday, think back to when God gave us at that intersection. This church and our responsibility in this nation has a responsibility for God. That he chose that day so that we would have the reminder, so that we don't make the same mistakes. And you see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that our fathers were all under the cloud. They all passed through the sea, and they were baptized in that sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. And that spiritual rock of Jesus Christ that followed them. But most of them, God was not pleased. We need to remember that if we as a church don't fulfill our responsibility, God will not be pleased with us. So it said in verse 6, why did God record all this? Why did he time this so specifically to that particular intersection? Because he doesn't want us to make the same mistakes. Why? Because this creation is built around what it says, the firstborn. It says, if not for the elect, no one would be saved. So God took 4,000 years lining everything up, specifically bringing it to it. When they could have had it 2 days sooner, God says, no, it's not time for that. Wait 2 days on Tammuz 17, because that's the day of warning. And I don't want my people to ever forget. That's why God's giving that to us today, because it's going to come a time that you and I will want to forget. When I hear people today talking about just leave us alone and let us worship ourselves by ourselves. Leading ministers and evangelists in the churches of God saying just leave us alone, let us do our thing. And God says, no, you have a responsibility. You get out there and you warn this world what's going on. And we have a responsibility. Our responsibility is to cry aloud. And that was the message in the Constitution of Christians, showing that for the last 100 years, this nation has been going down the tube, accepting Satan little by little by little. And it's our responsibility to point these things out to show about repentance. 2015, This was the year that I think was like the final judgment for our nation. Now, some of these things are going to come back. They might come around to the Supreme Court again. You know, they might come back. But 2015, on June 26th, was the Tammuz 9, the breach in the Old Testament, the walls. And then July 4th of the same year was Tammuz 17, is the breaching of the walls of the temple in the New Testament. Both of these fell right behind each other. 586 BC, Tammuz 9, the fall in Babylon. 70 AD, Tammuz 17. I mean, it's unbelievable. So what took place on the 26th? All right, what took place on the 26th? Both temples fell on the 9th of Av. Remember what happened on June 26th? Gay marriage was approved by this nation. The final breach of the wall between mankind and God. God's jump-off point, the physical. God was preparing a physical nation, Israel, to enter into the promised land, the spiritual. Through America, God is preparing a spiritual nation of Israel to enter into his kingdom. Over the course of nearly 4,000 years, God personally guided the movements of man to establish the opportunity for his church, the end-time spiritual Israelites, to fulfill his promises to the patriarchs and to receive the blessings and the warnings for an end-time warning message for the return of Jesus Christ. In that, God has left us. I think I'm going to be about 10 minutes longer than I should be, but I think it's important in this message, and I hope you bear with me. The character of the people of 1776. God blessed the nation with people of character that it would take to establish a free nation. From that, we can see that the character that you and I need to put inside of us has to be the same way, to establish the soon coming King of God. And the best way to talk about that character, I've got a video here by Paul Harvey. It's about the signers of the Declaration. Let's play that. It's about 7 minutes long, and I'll be right back.
Americans, the how and the why of our beloved republic are so much better known and understood than the who. The United States of America was born in 1776, but it was conceived 169 years before that. The earliest settlers had watered the New World with much sweat. They had built substantial holdings for themselves, for their families. And when the time came to separate themselves from a tyranny an ocean away, at best it meant starting all over again after the ravages of war. Researching what you're about to hear gave a whole new dimension to my reverence for our nation's first citizens. All others of the world's revolutions, before and since, were initiated by men who had nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. Our founders had everything to lose and nothing to gain, except one thing. But for any eve of the 4th of July, I, Paul Harvey, do herewith bequeath unto you something to remember. You may not be able to quote one line from the Declaration of Independence at this moment. Henceforth, you'll always be able to quote at least one line. It's in the last paragraph where you will recall when I remind you. It says, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." In the Pennsylvania State House that's now called Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the best men from each of the colonies sat down together. This was a very fortunate hour in our nation's history, one of those rare occasions in the lives of men when we had greatness to spare. These were men of means, well-educated. 24 were lawyers and jurists. 9 were farmers, owners of large plantations. On June 11, a committee sat down to draw up a Declaration of Independence. We were going to tell the British fatherland no more rule by redcoats. Below the dam of ruthless foreign rule, the stream of freedom was running shallow and muddy, and we were going to light a fuse to dynamite that dam. This pact, as Burke later put it, was a partnership between the living and the dead and the yet unborn. There was no bigotry, there was no demagoguery in this group. All had shared hardships. Jefferson finished a draft of the document in 17 days. Congress adopted it in July, and so much is familiar history. But now, King George III had denounced all rebels in America as traitors. Punishment for treason was hanging. The names now so familiar to you from the several signatures on that Declaration of Independence, the names were kept secret for 6 months, for each knew the full meaning of that magnificent last paragraph in which his signature pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. 56 men placed their names beneath that pledge. 56 men knew when they signed that they were risking everything. They knew if they won this fight, the best they could expect would be years of hardship in a struggling nation. And if they lost, they'd face a hangman's rope. But they signed the pledge. And here is the documented fate of that gallant 56. Carter Braxton of Virginia, wealthy planter, trader, saw his ships swept from the seas. To pay his debts, he lost his home and all of his properties and died in rags. Thomas Lynch Jr., who signed that pledge, was a third-generation rice grower, aristocrat, large plantation owner. After he signed, his health failed. His wife and he set out for France to regain his failing health. Their ship never got to France, was never heard from again. Thomas McKean of Delaware was so harassed by the enemy that he was forced to move his family 5 times in 5 months. He served in Congress without pay, his family in poverty and in hiding. Vandals looted the properties of Ellery and Clymer and Hall and Gwinnett and Walton and Hayward and Rutledge and Middleton. Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia raised $2 million on his own signature to provision our allies, the French fleet. After the war, he personally paid back the loans, wiped out his entire estate, and he was never reimbursed by his government. In the final battle for Yorktown, he, Nelson, urged General Washington to fire on his, Nelson's, own home, which was occupied by Cornwallis. It was destroyed. Thomas Nelson Jr. had pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. The Hessians seized the home of Francis Hopkinson of New Jersey. Francis Lewis had his home and everything destroyed, his wife imprisoned. She died within a few months. Richard Stockton, who signed that declaration, was captured, mistreated, his health broken to the extent that he died at 51. His estate was pillaged. Thomas Hayward Jr. was captured when Charleston fell. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside while she was dying. Their 13 children fled in all directions for their lives. His fields and grist mill were laid waste. For more than a year he lived in forests and caves and returned home after the war to find his wife dead, his children gone, his properties gone, and he died a few weeks later of exhaustion and a broken heart. Lewis Morris saw his land destroyed, his family scattered. Philip Livingston died within a few months from the hardships of the war. John Hancock, history remembers best due to a quirk of fate rather than anything he stood for. That great sweeping signature attesting to his vanity towers over the others. One of the wealthiest men in New England. And yet he stood outside Boston one terrible night of the war. And he said, "Burn Boston, though it makes John Hancock a beggar, if the public good requires it." So he too lived up to the pledge. Of the 56, few were long to survive. 5 were captured by the British and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes from Rhode Island to Charleston sacked, looted, occupied by the enemy, or burned. 2 lost their sons in the army. 1 had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 died in the war from its hardships or from its more merciful bullets. I don't know what impression you had of the men who met that summer in Philadelphia. But I think it's important that we remember this about them. They were not poor men. They were not wild-eyed pirates. These were men of means. They were rich men, most of them, and had enjoyed much ease and luxury in their personal living. Not hungry men, certainly not terrorists, not irresponsible malcontents, not fanatical incendiaries. These men were prosperous men, wealthy landowners, They were substantially secure in their prosperity. They had everything to lose. But they considered liberty, and this is as much as I shall say of it. They had learned that liberty is so much more important than security, that they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they fulfilled their pledge. They paid the price, and freedom was born.
Surely you can't help but draw the parallel that called in this life as we prepare to bring the entire world to freedom with Jesus Christ, that God has called upon us to pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to be a part with Him for that return of Jesus Christ. Today we're blessed to look back at an amazing corner of July 4th as God's jump-off point. It was the D-Day and the beginning of the push of Jesus Christ to take back mankind that was taken captive by the enemy and given back to its rightful owner. It will not stop until the next jump-off point in God's plan of redemption, and that will take place at the sound of the trump. So I ask one question: what are we waiting for? What an opportunity that God's given to each one of us to cry aloud and to spare not that Jesus Christ is coming back. And this miserable, sick, sin world is finally going to be rescued from itself. And you have that opportunity, just like those men that you saw in that video with Paul Harvey, to make a difference in this world. Well, I'm going to close my part of this sermon, but there's one more video I want you to see. And then when it's over, just have the song leader come on up, and we'll close the song today. But this is a song that was given. This is the very first time it was brought to the public. It was a song by Kate Smith. This is the original version, the first time it was sang to America. It is God Bless America. Have a great 4th, and God willing, I'll see you next Sabbath.
Of our program, Miss Kate Smith.
Hello, everybody. It is my happy privilege to introduce a new song, God Bless America. While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful for a land so fair, as we raise our voices in a solemn prayer. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountain to the prairie to the ocean white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountain to the prairie to the ocean.
Bye, Daddy.
Bye, dude.
Don't be late.
No?
White with gold. God bless America. My home. Sweet.
Right, Pop?
Right, son.
God bless America, land that I love. Beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountain to the prairie, to the ocean, white with foam. God bless America.
Kind of makes you think of Blake, doesn't it? Makes you think of a lot of things. We're going to be in this yet, Mom.
Hello, son.
Hi, Mom.
Hello, darling.
New song?
Brand new, first time of the year. Brand new, my eye. You know, I threw that song out of Yip Yip Yap Hank 22 years ago. Sounds better now.